Well, where is the evidence? I ask you, I'm a lawyer. Where is the evidence that Pilate knew anything at all about Jesus? Jesus is arrested by the temple guard, okay? He's put on trial in the middle of the night by the Jewish leaders, okay? And then before anybody could find out what happened to him. And then he's brought before Pilate very early on Friday morning so that Pilate could dispatch him. But Pilate wasn't going to do that because the first thing out of his mouth is, who is this man and why are you bringing him to me? You know, he had to follow Roman law. Even under Roman law, you don't just kill people. There has to be a trial of some sort and there are procedures to be followed. There's paperwork to be filled out, okay? But the Jewish leaders are pushing for Jesus to be executed. And Pilate realizes that there's a problem here. So Jesus comes back after being scourged and he's standing there dripping blood, and they've mocked him. They put the crown of thorns on him and the robe on him. And Pilate says, behold the man, you know. In other words, is this enough for you? And they see him and it's not enough. They start shouting, crucify him, crucify him. They want him dead. They don't want him just punished. So when Pilate hears that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, and he had already said, my kingdom is not of this world, Pilate goes back in and says, where are you from? Jesus doesn't answer. They say, if you don't put him to death, you are no friend of Caesar. What they were saying is this: if you don't put Jesus to death, we will tell Tiberius that you, Pilate, refused to execute someone whom we brought to you on a charge of treason. And guess what? Pilate would be put to death because Tiberius would suspect Pilate of being disloyal. So they basically blackmailed Pilate.
Hi, γεια σας. Σήμερα με την ευκαιρία της έκδοσης του βιβλίου «Η Σταύρωση του Βασιλιάς της Δόξης» της πρεσβυτέρας Ευγενίας Κωνσταντίνου στα ελληνικά από τη Μονή Μαχαιρά και τις εκδόσεις Σταμούλη, και λόγω του ότι συμμετείχα σε αυτό το υπέροχο project μεταφράζοντας το βιβλίο από τα αγγλικά στα ελληνικά, ήθελα να δούμε μαζί κάποια πολύ ενδιαφέρον σημεία του βιβλίου και έχουμε μαζί μας την πρεσβυτέρα για να μας απαντήσει και να μας εξηγήσει περισσότερα για το βιβλίο. Πρεσβυτέρα, καλώς ορίσατε.
Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ. Καλώς σας βρήκαμε.
I'm going to give some information like on your bio and then we can switch to English.
Εντάξει, αλλά θα προσπαθήσω να απαντήσω στα ελληνικά όταν μπορώ.
Πολύ ωραία, ευχαριστώ πολύ. Η πρεσβυτέρα, Δόκτωρ Πρεσβυτέρα Ευγενία Κωνσταντίνου, είναι μια ευρέως αναγνωρισμένη ορθόδοξη ομιλήτρια και συγγραφέα στις Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες. Έχει προσελκύσει ένα διεθνές κοινό μέσω των 2 μακροχρόνιων εκπομπών της, ψάχνοντας τις γραφές και ψάχνοντας τις γραφές ζωντανά, στο ραδιόφωνο του εκδοτικού οίκου Ancient Faith. Τα πιο πρόσφατα της βιβλία είναι το Thinking Orthodox, Understanding and Acquiring the Orthodox Christian Mind και η Σταύρωση του Βασιλιά της Δόξης, η εκπληκτική ιστορία και το μεγαλειώδες μυστήριο των παθών. Η Δόκτωρ Κωνσταντίνου κατέχει 5 πτυχία θεολογίας, συμπεριλαμβανομένων του Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology, στο οποίο ειδικεύτηκε στην πατερική θεολογία, και του Harvard Divinity School, στο οποίο επικεντρώθηκε στην Καινή Διαθήκη. Απέκτησε προηγουμένως πτυχίο νομικής και εργάστηκε ως δικηγόρος πριν συνεχίσει τις ανώτερες σπουδές της στη θεολογία. Η πρεσβυτέρα Ευγενία πήρε το διδακτορικό της από το Πανεπιστήμιο Λαβάλ, στο Quebec City του Καναδά, στο οποίο ειδικεύτηκε στην Αποκάλυψη κατά την αρχαία Εκκλησία της Ανατολής. Δημιούργησε την πρώτη μετάφραση σε σύγχρονη γλώσσα του αρχαιότερου ελληνικού πατερικού κειμένου, με σχόλια στο βιβλίο της Αποκάλυψης, από τον Άγιο Ανδρέα Κεσσαρίας. Η Δ. Κωνσταντίνου συνταξιοδοτήθηκε πρόσφατα μετά από πολλά χρόνια ακαδημαϊκής διδασκαλίας στον χώρο των βιβλικών σπουδών και του πρώιμου χριστιανισμού. Είναι νυμφευμένη με τον πατέρα Κώστα, ο οποίος είναι κληρικός, και έχουν ένα γιο, το Χριστόφορο. Presbyter, I have to say I'm very excited about this book coming out in Greek. I'm very thankful for taking the time and, us having this discussion and conversation together.
Είναι μεγάλη μου χαρά να έχουμε την ευκαιρία αυτή να μιλήσουμε μαζί. Αυτό που δεν είπες, ότι εσύ μετάφρασες αυτό το βιβλίο. Και είναι μεγάλη μου τιμή που κάποιος ήθελε και πήρε το καιρό που χρειάζεται και δεν είναι εύκολη δουλειά να μεταφράσεις ένα βιβλίο. Έκανες πάρα πολλή δουλειά και εσύ μαζί με το μοναστήρι να βγάλετε αυτό το βιβλίο σε ηλική γλώσσα. Είναι μεγάλη μου τιμή να γίνεται αυτό. Και I'm very excited about that.
Thank you so much. I have to admit that, it was a huge blessing translating the book. And I miss it sometimes because it keeps your mind with the thoughts of God.
Yes. Yeah, Yes, I know exactly what you mean. Γιατί μίλησες για την Αποκάλυψη που μετάφρασα αυτό το μεγάλο, commentary, την ερμηνεία που έβγαλε ο Άγιος Ανδρέας της Κεσαρίας. And when your mind is on the subject so deeply, it affects you. And I think it makes you a better person when you're translating these spiritual things. I know what you mean.
Yeah, I think it does. And it's a huge blessing. And I'm very grateful that we're going to have it in Greek and people will be able to, I felt that it opens a window and you see behind the New Testament and you see what was going on. It's like you're watching all the movements and all the scenes that, you know.
That's right. And, I would love to be able to speak more in Greek, but it's going to slow us down. And I will be struggling sometimes to find the right vocabulary. So I think I will go ahead and just switch to English here. I appreciate that you said that, because that's what I wanted to do with the book, because so many books have been written about the crucifixion of Christ. I said, well, what could I really say that people haven't said before or even said better? But it was the combination of all those factors that I wanted for people to feel like they were really living through it or experiencing it in a fresh way, in a deeper way, because we hear these Gospels every single year during Holy Week, and we feel like we know everything there is to know. What more can we say about it? We know it so well. But I was thinking about this today. The evangelists, when they wrote those Gospels, they assumed that people understood the backstory. So if I was they didn't feel like they had to explain everything, because people lived in that world and they knew that world. So if I was going to write a story, set in Greece, there would be many things I would have to explain to an American reader that they don't understand about the lifestyle in modern Greece, let's say. So we have the gospel accounts of the Passion of Christ, but it's really very, very limited about what it explains to us. The rest of it was either known already because people lived in that culture, or it was explained through the tradition of the church. And we don't have that. We have some of the church tradition, of course, but the depth of meaning, we don't understand. So I wanted to give people that feeling that they were sort of in a corner of the room watching these things unfolding and understanding them in a way that most of us don't, because the great danger for us in the church is a kind of sense of complacency, that we're comfortable, we think we know everything, and so the story doesn't impact us because it's too familiar. So that was what I'm very happy to hear you say, that you felt like you were getting a behind the scenes look, because that's what I wanted to achieve with the book. And I wanted it to be something that was exciting, even though people know what's going to happen. That was my other concern. I said, well, how can I make this interesting when we already know what happens to Christ? I wanted to move quickly and read almost like a novel, but not really in a dramatized way, but just in an informative way. So you could finish the book and feel like you understand the world of Christ and the apostles in a different way.
Yeah. I think it makes you feel closer, like reading the book and understanding and going beyond the yes. gospel and yes. having all the information that you gathered. I think it helps you to actually grasp what was going on, and you feel closer to Christ. You feel closer to the events, to the Holy Gospel every Sunday. Like you listen to, oh yeah, I remember maybe yes. parts of that. Yeah,
I remember what that is, because the other reason why it's difficult for us sometimes to understand what happened is because we love Christ. So we don't understand why other people hated him. We don't understand why they wanted to crucify him. We don't understand why, for example, Pilate decides to crucify him, even though he says 3 times, I find no guilt in him. Why did Pilate suddenly decide? And I explained that in the book. And once you read it, you say, oh, now I understand. Now it makes perfect sense. So these kinds of things, which were very well understood, the evangelists just hint at them. They didn't have to explain it. And even the most basic thing, the crucifixion itself, all they said, it's so simple. What the evangelist said is just, and they crucified him. So brief. But the reader of the times who knew what that meant, oh my gosh, they would, if they had picked up the gospel and just read it, they could never believe that this happened, but because they understood what that meant. And we have some understanding of it, but not the way they did. For people for whom this was a real reality.
Yeah, I have some questions on that, but before I ask those, I wanna go on. I think this is a common question of today, and even though we are an Orthodox nation, I think a lot of people have this thought or this idea about the Bible and about the Gospels, about the New Testament, like, oh, how reliable is it? We think today in this world, this logically run world, right, that they're just stories for us to believe in God, and somebody made them up, and just good thoughts and whatever. But you mention in the book, and you actually speak about how scientifically, right, established are these Gospels and obviously all the texts.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up, because yes, Greece is an Orthodox nation, but Greece has been impacted like the rest of the world with mass media by joining the European Union, very much influenced now by Western thought and these ideas which we hear in the media, things that my grandparents would never have said. Oh, how do we know the Bible is true? They probably would have smacked us, right, for saying that. What are you saying? What are you talking about? They would never have said these kinds of things. But because we live in a different era, because we're influenced by the West to ask these kind of doubting questions that are very common, unfortunately, among Bible scholars in the West, these are the kinds of things that people are now asking. How can we rely on the Gospels? So yes, I did address that in the introduction to the book. So I hope everyone reads that part also. So what do we say about the historical reliability of the Gospels? Now, what's happened today, what you should know, is that today, Bible scholars of the West, and unfortunately a few Orthodox, but not too many of the Orthodox have done this yet, but in the Catholic and Protestant world, not that they're not believers, but they believe that they should only accept something that they can explain with the rational mind. Now, some, of course, they're still believers in God, but sometimes when you read what they say, you say, does this person even really believe in God? Because they question the miracles. And this comes out of the beginning of the scientific era in the 19th century and in the 20th century. And this kind of thought process moved into biblical studies also. And so they almost feel pressured to have this kind of skepticism, like it's a virtue, ierateu, to question the Bible. You're not taken seriously as a Bible scholar if you approach it from a standpoint of faith. And that's why the Orthodox scholars are not respected by the West. That's a fact. I know this from my years at Harvard Divinity and from being part of that academic world. They don't respect us because we will never question certain things. Like we will never say, well, is Jesus really God? How can we know that Jesus is God? This is never going to happen. Okay, in the Orthodox, for an Orthodox theologian, there are certain things we accept on the basis of faith, and we interpret the Bible according to the fathers, and they don't think that that's worthwhile. They think you should just use your imagination, or you should use your analytical brain or your powers of reasoning. That's the Western manner of thought. So but in contrast to that, believe it or not, historians find the Gospels to be very credible sources of actual historical information. And so when I was reading Roman historians and they're citing the Bible as a historical document, I thought, what's wrong with the Bible scholars who don't consider the Bible necessarily a historical document? So, for example, the earliest account of someone using his right to appeal to Caesar, a Roman citizen, is in the Bible. It's St. Paul saying, I appeal to Caesar. And Roman historians point to that as a reliable historical source. So my point is this: well, the Bible scholars of the West feel that they won't be taken seriously if they accept the truth of the Bible, or that all of the miracles have to have some kind of natural explanation, some rational basis. Historians don't think about it that way. The other thing is that some people will say that the Bible shouldn't be taken seriously as a historical source because it's a religious document and there's a bias. Well, let's talk about that. First of all, every writing, every broadcast, every podcast, whatever it is, every communication has a bias. That means the person has a point of view. That doesn't mean that what they're saying is not true. And just because a document has a religious component to it doesn't mean that the historical facts are not true. And historians know that if they were to discard everything that has some kind of a religious component, they would be ignoring so much of what we have, in terms of documentation. So that alone is not a reason to dismiss it. The other thing that historians look at is whether or not, how far away from the actual events the document is. So in the case of the Gospels, they were all written in the 1st century. And that means that they were written within the lifetime of people who actually knew Christ. And those are called first-generation sources. And they are the most powerful and most important sources of information, because this is when the document is considered to be the most reliable, because the author is not going to embellish and add details. If you think about it, if you've ever read any of the Apocrypha, like the Proto-Evangelium of James, it's very different than the Gospels because it's long after the time of the Gospels. So it's very sensationalized, very emotional, kind of, we would say in English, over the top, exaggerated, okay? The Gospels are very straightforward and very simple. And they were all written within the lifetimes of people who knew the Lord. So that's very important. And this is something that excites a historian, because historians of antiquity rarely have a source of information about a historical figure. Like Jesus is a historical figure. They rarely have a first-generation source. If they do, they have one. We have 4. We have 4 first-generation sources about Jesus Christ written by different people in different places at different times that agree on, it's not that they agree on every detail, but they agree on everything else, just about. They agree that Jesus was, conceived by the Holy Spirit, his mother was a virgin, things like that. They agree about the crucifixion, that Pontius Pilate was the governor, that it was a decision of the chief priests and the high priest. You see what I'm trying to say? So the fact that you have 4 sources that are in tremendous agreement, that are written by different people, just adds to the veracity of the Gospels. Any objective person would look at it like that. And historians tend to accept them as valid sources of historical information. They might not accept the religious conclusion, but they accept them as a historical document. In other words, we can't prove from the Gospels that Jesus was the Son of God. We have to accept that on the basis of, of faith. But there's something else too that we should consider. This is something else that they look at. When we look at the entire Gospel, or the entire, whatever the book is, we look at the historical details and we ask ourselves, does this ring true in other respects? In other words, when we look at the Gospels, are they trustworthy about other things? Are they trustworthy about who the Pharisees are? Do they accurately describe who the Pharisees were, who the scribes were, what Pontius Pilate, he was the governor, that there was a place called the Sea of Galilee? If all of those things are true, that means that it is very likely that other things that are described in the book are also true. In other words, they're very verifiable indirectly. And there's something else we should consider, that from a very objective historical perspective, comparing the Gospels to other ancient writings about people like kings, and the whole Bible, by the way, the whole Bible presents us the truth. This is not the case with other ancient writings. For example, if you were a court historian and you were supposed to write about the king, it better be flattering. They weren't supposed to be honest. They were only supposed to talk about how great the king was and all of his wonderful successes. But the Gospels talk about the most shameful thing possible that Jesus Christ allowed happen to him, and that's the crucifixion. So why would, or Peter's denials, or Judas's betrayal, which was considered very, very shocking and very scandalous in the ancient world. The gospel writers are honest, and to any person living at the time, that would shine through. So it's very clear. I'll mention a couple of other things because I think this is very important, and I thank you for asking the question. When Matthew, let's just take Matthew for example, when Matthew was writing his gospel, and we don't know exactly when that was, whether it was the year 50 or 60 or 80, or John was writing in the year 90, perhaps as late as that. When they were writing their gospels, they weren't writing them for us 2,000 years from now. They didn't say, well, I can add this in. This didn't really happen, but I'll say it because 2,000 years from now, they're not going to know. Of course not. They're writing the gospels for their community, in which there were people who actually knew Jesus or knew people who knew Jesus. So this is why the first generation sources are so credible, so reliable, because the author is not going to lie. He's not going to exaggerate things, because there would be living people who could say, well, this is not true. This didn't happen. Do you see my point? And that's what makes the Gospels so actually very credible. So today I'm always amazed when I hear Bible scholars say, oh, they just made that up. Jesus didn't really say these things. He didn't really do these things. But there were so many eyewitnesses. And there were so many people who were witnesses to these things. The evangelists cared about their own reputation. And Luke, at the very beginning of his gospel, actually says, I examined all of these things. I investigated everything. I'm telling you, Theophilus, that everything that's in my book is true. They cared about the truth too, you know. But this idea that they didn't care and they just made things up in their fables and myths, that's a lot of nonsense. And we have every reason to believe in the credibility of the Gospels. I will give you one more thing. I'll say one more thing. even though I've been talking for a long time, and I apologize. Because the most common thing that people question today are the miracles of the Lord, right? This never happened, and this never happened, and they made this up, and they want to make Jesus look like he was God. The fact is that we have Jewish sources from the late 1st century. That's a Jewish historian called Flavius Josephus, who actually talks about Jesus, mentions that he was very popular, that he was a man who was a great wonder worker, and that he was crucified by their leaders. He mentions this. That's the end of the 1st century. He's a first generation witness, okay, even though he didn't know Jesus. He's a Jewish historian. Now, after him in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, there are also other Jewish writers who talk about Jesus. They're negative. They want to make him look bad, so they say things that aren't true. But they'll say that but they never deny that the miracles happened. They never deny that. They will say that Jesus did it through trickery or sorcery, because that's what they were saying about him in his own lifetime, right? The point is, the easiest thing to do would have been to say the Christians are lying, Jesus never did any miracles. But that never occurred to them because his reputation, because so many people had actually witnessed these miracles. They could never say that. So instead they had to explain how he was able to fool the people, let's put it that way. But the fact that even early Jewish sources never questioned the fact that Jesus had a reputation as a wonder worker proves indirectly that Jesus really did these things.
I think people will need to, if you just take this part and you actually think that, there is really no doubt, like historically as well, there is no doubt, then you have to reevaluate everything in your life.
That's right.
And everything you believe in, and everything that the way you perceive things. So this is amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I want to continue. I want to touch. So the week of the Passions is like, the most beautiful in a way, or important and in our liturgical life, in the church.
Medallia of the Mother is so important and so beautiful. Yes.
And in the book, you speak about the 3 catalysts that lead to Christ's crucifixion.
Mm-hmm.
So starting from the first one, which is the raising of Lazarus. And Saint Lazarus is also special for us because he was the bishop of Gideon in Cyprus. So he's a patron saint of Larnaca. So we feel very close to him. He feels very close to us. And we do have, big celebration, the Saturday to Sabato do Lazaro and all this stuff. So I would think like, simple, that somebody raising somebody from the dead, that would make everybody be shocked and amazed and believe in him, and totally believe in him. But we say, in the book, you write that this is the first reason why they wanted to kill him, why they wanted to crucify him. How can that be?
It's amazing. It's amazing when you think about it, because rather than say he must be the Messiah, they say this is a problem. We have to get rid of him. That's right. That's exactly right. Yes, the raising of Lazarus is really the beginning of the end for the Lord, and he kind of knows it. All right, because it is the greatest sign that he ever did. And that's because even though he had raised other people from the dead, Jairus' daughter, the son of the widow of Nain, and probably other people that we don't know about, we have to remember that Jesus did amazing things every single day of his ministry. And the Lord, most of what the Lord did was never written down. So he probably raised other people too that we don't know about. But Lazarus was different, because it occurred in Bethany, which was very close to Jerusalem. And when he died, People came from Jerusalem to mourn with the sisters, to prepare the body, to carry him to the tomb. So everybody knew that he was completely dead. They couldn't say, well, he just fell asleep, or he was in a coma, or something like this. They couldn't say that because they put him in the tomb. So when the Lord came 4 days later, it was obvious that he was very dead. And he, this couldn't be a mistake. There was no mistake. And of course, we know that the Lord intentionally waited, not for Lazarus to die, because he died on the day that the Lord got the message. He arrived 4 days later, so he had been dead for 4 days. But he waited to be sure that nobody could question this raising. And so when it happens, it says that some people, of course, this is where the imagination comes in, because the Gospel of John doesn't tell us how people reacted, but we can imagine how they reacted. But it does say one thing, that some of them went back and immediately told the great Sanhedrin what had happened. And there was an emergency meeting. And they said, what are we going to do? This man does too many signs. If we let him go on like this, the Romans will come and take away our thesi. It's not just the temple. They were concerned about their political position. They're not just worried about the temple. This is how it's translated sometimes. They're going to take away the holy place, but they're going to take away our thesi in the holy place. Our role as the people who are responsible for the temple. They weren't worried that the Romans would destroy the temple, but that if Jesus was able to start a revolt because people would recognize him as the Messiah because of the sign, then the chief priest and the high priest would show that they were not in control of the people, and the Romans would take away their power. That's what's really behind this. So it is the raising of Lazarus. It is the first day that they have this meeting and they decide he has to die very soon, and that would be before Passover. Now, the other thing that's very important about the raising of Lazarus, which we in the Orthodox Church know, but other people don't, because other Christians don't celebrate the raising of Lazarus. Our church places that the day before Palm Sunday in order to show the connection. So the church is intentionally showing us that, because John says it was because of the raising of Lazarus that the people came out to Jerusalem to greet the Lord as he came into the city and shouted, Hosanna, Son of David, King of Israel. These are messianic titles. So John explains to us the connection between the raising of Lazarus, and it's a very important historical thing. So I like to point this out because the church, the Orthodox Church, is very interested in making sure that we understand what happened to the Lord. And as Orthodox Christians, we don't appreciate how wonderful and how deep and how profound the services of Holy Week are, and how they prepare us for the passion of the Lord and the resurrection. Because in the Western world, for the Catholic Church, for example, believe it or not, on Palm Sunday, they read the gospel of the crucifixion. And they don't do anything special on Monday. They have palm branches and they enter the church and whatnot. But the gospel reading for that Sunday, they call it Passion Sunday, is about the crucifixion. I think because they're looking forward to the crucifixion. But they do nothing for Holy Monday, nothing for Holy Tuesday, nothing for Holy Wednesday. Thursday, Jesus is, having the Last Supper. There's nothing to explain why the Jews arrested him and wanted him crucified. Whereas we have all those gospel readings beginning Palm Sunday evening, Monday evening, where they're confronting, and the book, as you know, discusses all of these things. By what authority do you do these things? Who gave you that authority? The coin offered to Caesar, Jesus, the parables about the two sons and the tenants in the vineyard, things that were very insulting to the Jewish leaders. But our church shows the growing animosity that they have toward Christ. And it takes us step by step through the betrayal and the contrasting the decision of Judas with the sinful woman. I mean, all of these things. The church, if we go to church every day, every evening during Holy Week, it all unfolds for us like a magnificent play that if we don't go to church every night of Holy Week, we don't understand all the things.
That's true. And it helps to see the whole event, the whole connection. I guess
but it also shows, it shows how the church thinks that is important for us to know. That's what I'm trying to bring out. The church isn't saying, just come on Friday and hold your candle and sing the Engomia, and that's enough. The church wants us to participate in this, to follow Christ step by step, and to understand what happened to him, because it matters. It's not like the Jews, because people ask you this also, ask me this all the time. Why did they say on Sunday, Hosanna, son of David, and on Friday, crucify him? Okay?
That would be my question, yeah.
Well, why do they do this? Because it makes them sound like there's some kind of strange creatures that all of a sudden they change just like this. And of course, priests love to say this. On Sunday, they shouted Hosanna, and on Friday they shouted crucify him. It wasn't like that at all. The Jewish people didn't turn against Jesus. That's the truth. And in the book, I explain how it was that the Jewish leaders gathered I'm talking about the chief priests, because of where the trial before Pilate was taking place, how they had their people present and they brought them there. It was this, and it's clear in the Gospels, if you read it, they created the crowd that shouted for the crucifixion of Christ. They told them what to say. This is not some random group of people who all of a sudden change their minds and think Jesus deserves to die. You see how nonsensical that is?
It was a question that I had, and when reading and translating the book, I thought, okay, that makes sense. It wasn't the same people, because it obviously is something that you think of, like it doesn't, but then the way you explain and, the events and whatever happens, you realize. And at the same time, something maybe we don't know or we don't realize is the way that the priesthood, or the way that the corruption that exists.
Yes. Oh my goodness. This is so fascinating. And one of the things that I spent a lot of time on in the book is, first of all, to explain what the temple is. So you mentioned the catalyst. The first is the raising of Lazarus. This is what brings the people to greet Christ as he enters Jerusalem, and to greet him as the Messiah, because there were so many people who were present at the raising of Lazarus, and they came back to Jerusalem and they told people about it. So they greet him as the Messiah, and this alarms the chief priests. And then the last thing is that Jesus is the cleansing of the temple, which in the Synoptics we have at the very end of Christ's life, the last week, and in John it's early in the ministry. And frankly, when it happens is not as important as what it means and why he did it. And here's something else that's usually misunderstood by people. They just think that Jesus lost his temper. When we get angry, we will say, Jesus lost his temper too. But it's not that at all, okay? So he was a threat to the vast amounts of money that came to the high priest and the chief priests from what took place at the temple. And in the book, I explain, first of all, what the temple was like, because we think of it like a big church, but it was massive. And there was so much money, so much wealth, so much gold there that they gave up counting it, years and not years before, centuries before. The Jews stopped counting the money in the treasury. There was so much wealth, they couldn't count it. And the covered all of the golden bowls and silver bowls and a solid altar, and the size of the altar, it was 50 feet square and 20 feet high. I mean, massive columns. I'm describing the temple so people can have some understanding of what it was. And here comes this rabbi from Galilee, whoever he is, and comes there and disrupts the buying and selling of animals and the changing of money, which is how the chief priests became so wealthy. And they did not want that. This is why they were afraid of losing the thessi, okay? That meant control of the temple. So they were tremendously corrupt, and all the Jewish people at the time knew it. And of course, I explained how this was, and which was very fascinating for me also was to read the Jewish sources of the period that talk about why the temple was destroyed. And part of this was, I was very curious about the tearing of the temple curtain. I was always wondered, why did that happen and what did that mean? And I found at least 10 different explanations for it. But one of the things was the corruption, and that Jewish sources after the destruction of the temple talked about how strange things were happening in the temple. They were omens that the temple would be destroyed, and they started happening 40 years before its destruction in the year 70. 40 years before is the year 30, when the Lord came to earth. And why did things change when the Lord came to earth? Because he was the temple of God. Because the temple at Jerusalem was the place for the Jews where God was present. But when the Son of God was incarnate, now the presence of God on earth is in the person of the Son of God. And that's why the animal sacrifices were no longer necessary, and everything changed. So it's, but the corruption, yes, very, very dramatically. And all of this, I didn't make it up. I didn't make it up because I it's not that Christians wrote about how corrupt the Jews were. It was the Jews who wrote about how corrupt their own leaders were. So that comes from Jewish sources.
That's interesting to get that kind of perspective, right? Because we always say, "Oh, it's our perspective because we want it to be that way," but it wasn't. It was a perspective from Jewish sources. So that's interesting.
Yes, and one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book was because most people will never learn about this, okay? Mm-hmm. Because unless you're Jewish and you're raised in these circles, or you're in an academic world like mine, New Testament, Roman history, this kind of thing, unless you know where to look for these kinds of things, you'll never find them, because this is very specialized. And the other thing that I thought was very amazing was to explain the connection between the sacrifice of Isaac and the death of Christ on that specific day, what it meant to the Jews, and also the way the Passover lambs were slaughtered and how this relates to the crucifixion. And all of these things are really, not that they're completely unknown, especially about the connection between Isaac and Christ as a type of Christ. We knew that, but the depth of the connection, we wouldn't know. So the thing that when I was trying to decide whether to write the book, I realized that I have a knowledge in a lot of areas that I could bring all these things together. Because many theologians have written books about the crucifixion, or pastors, clergy, or, doctors have written about the crucifixion from a physical point of view, or lawyers have, but very few people have an expertise in all of these areas and can describe them and bring it all together. And that's what I was trying to do in the book.
And it makes it extremely interesting to wrap your head all around there. Yes. One of the other things that impressed me was Pilate.
Yes.
And it was, I don't think I ever understood before reading the book, the whole, step by step what happened. Could you take us a bit through the reluctancy, let's say, of Pilate?
Yes. Well, this is one of the, again, you see, modern Bible scholars, because we know Pilate is mentioned in other ancient sources, and he was a brutal guy, because to be governor of any province in the Roman Empire, especially in Judea, you had to be very tough, and you had to rule in a very strong way so that people would not revolt. So we know about the character of Pilate. And when Bible scholars read the Gospels, they say, oh, this couldn't have happened this way, because Pilate was anxious to release Jesus, right? He wanted to release Jesus. And because of this, most Bible scholars will say that is not true. That can't be right. The church, this is their argument. It's not true, but I'll tell you what they say. The church was trying to put the blame on the Jewish leaders so as not to get the Romans upset. Well, let me first tell you that the Romans would not be upset with Pilate wanting they would, in other words, the gospel writers would not want to present Pilate in a sympathetic way to satisfy the Romans. The Romans would want him to be tough. They would want him to execute a person quickly. You see what I'm trying to say? The Romans wouldn't be happy with that portrayal of Pilate as somebody who was afraid, okay? It's not that the gospel writers were trying to shift the blame to the Jews. We say in the Creed, he was crucified under Pontius Pilate for a reason, because it's a historical fact. So what happened is historically accurate. One of the things that people say is that Pilate must have known about Jesus, and so he had no problem putting him to death. Well, where is the evidence? I ask you, I'm a lawyer. Where is the evidence that Pilate knew anything at all about Jesus? The evidence in the Gospels is quite the contrary. Jesus is arrested by the temple guard, okay? He's put on trial in the middle of the night by the Jewish leaders, okay? And then before anybody could find out what happened to him, and then he's brought before Pilate very early on Friday morning so that Pilate could dispatch him. And the Jewish leaders must have realized, or they expected him to simply ask no questions. Well, we say in English, rubber stamp. You know, the Greeks love their stamps too. You go to the trapeza, lots of stamps. Etsi, αυτό περιμένω να πω τον Πόντιος Πιλάτος, okay? Okay, he goes to the cross. But Pilate wasn't going to do that, because the first thing out of his mouth is, who is this man and why are you bringing him to me? Which shows us Pilate has never heard of Jesus. Now, why is that important? Because people say that Pilate would not have ever behaved like this, that he would quickly have executed anybody. Well, first of all, as a human being, very few people will simply put someone to death for no reason. Secondly, as a governor of a province, he had to answer to his boss. He had to keep records. He had to know why this person deserved to die. He had to follow Roman law. Even under Roman law, you don't just kill people. There has to be a trial of some sort, and there are procedures to be followed. There's paperwork to be filled out, okay? Now, so Pilate never heard of Jesus. The reason why this is significant is Pilate it shows Jesus's innocence, because Pilate definitely had a network of spies, as did the Herods, who would report to him about any possible problems so that he could stop it, right? Because there were many, many people who attempted to revolt against Rome, okay? So they wanted to stop this sort of thing. That's the reason why he's in Jerusalem for Passover. Now, that is the reason for the question about the coin and Caesar. Should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? That's why the Pharisees asked the question. So they would have something to report to Pilate about to get Jesus arrested. Okay? So the people say, well, he must have known about Jesus. And I would say, why? Why would Pilate know about Jesus? Where did Jesus go preaching? In synagogues? At the temple? In people's houses? Where were Romans going to encounter him? Nowhere. And he spoke in Aramaic. He's not speaking Latin or Greek to the crowds. He's not preaching to Romans. So the Romans never really interacted with Jesus, and he was never brought to their attention because there was no reason to bring him to Pilate's attention. because Jesus was not a threat. You see, this points to the innocence of Christ. So when people say, well, what about all the miracles Jesus did? Somebody would have brought it to Pilate. For what reason? Why would Pilate care? Well, Pilate, we think there's something you should know. Well, what is it? There's this rabbi who's preaching and attracting large crowds. Well, what about it? What's he doing? Oh, he's telling people to love their enemies. What are you going to tell Pilate? What are you going to say? Do you know how he would say, don't bother me. I'm a busy man. Why are you bothering me with this? Do you see my point? So all of these logical reasons that people give why Pilate must have known about Jesus really don't hold any water. So they bring Jesus to Pontius Pilate. He says, who is this man? Why have you brought him to me? Jesus goes into the praetorium. Pilate comes in later. And the first words out of Pilate's mouth are you the king of the Jews? Ah, that's very important. Because it shows us that the charge is political. Because actually, before Jesus enters the praetorium, Pilate says, who is this man and why have you brought him? And he says, the Jewish leaders say this, if he wasn't an evildoer, we wouldn't have brought him to you. And Pilate says, take him away and judge him according to your own law, which they had the right to do. And they actually had already judged him according to their law, but they couldn't pass the death sentence. So they realized that, first of all, that he's an evildoer, just handle it, get rid of him. Shows you that they really didn't have a charge that met the standards of Roman law, because they should have made their case and said, this man is an insurrectionist. He's trying to start a revolt against Rome. They can't say that because they have no witnesses. They have no evidence, right? So Jesus goes into the praetorium, and we don't know what they said to Pilate, but they must have said, he's claiming to be a king. He wants to start a revolt. And this is where the entry to Jerusalem comes in. Because when the Lord entered the city, people said, Hosanna, King of Israel, Hosanna to the Son of David. That's a messianic title, and the Messiah was expected to bring about the new kingdom. So they came up with a charge that would carry the death penalty, and that is treason. So Pilate comes into the praetorium and he says to Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? And what does the Lord say? My kingdom is not of this world. If it were of this world, my followers would fight for me. That's a very good point. That shows you that he wasn't a threat. But even before he says, my kingdom is not of this world, he says, where have you heard this? From other people? And Pilate says, am I a Jew? Your own leaders have brought you here, right? What does that mean? This shows Jesus is trying to point out to Pilate that Pilate has heard nothing about him. This is also how we know, you see, that Pilate knew nothing about Jesus. So he says, and when he says, my kingdom is not of this world, and Pilate says, I'm a busy man, don't bother me with this. So he goes out and says, I find no crime in him. But the Jewish leaders are pushing for Jesus to be executed. And Pilate realizes that there's a problem here. Now remember that Pilate has to work with these people. These are the chief priests. They are the highest level of the leaders among the Jews in Jerusalem. And Pilate wants to have a good relationship with them. He figures Jesus must have done something to aggravate them or annoy them. So he thinks that he will pacify them or mollify them, placate them by having Jesus scourged. So he sends Jesus to be scourged. And that's a horrible punishment. Second to crucifixion. It was terrible. So Jesus comes back after being scourged, and he's standing there dripping blood, and they've mocked him. They put the crown of thorns on him and the robe on him. And Pilate says, behold the man, In other words, is this enough for you? And they see him, and it's not enough. They start shouting, crucify him, crucify him. They want him dead. They don't want him just punished. They want him dead. And Pilate says, why? What has he done? And then they say, we have a law, and by that law, he ought to die, for he made himself the Son of God. Now we find out the real reason why they want him dead. You see, he was convicted by the Jews, not on treason, but for blasphemy, for claiming to be the Son of God. He was convicted for being who he was, effectively. So when Pilate hears that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, and he had already said, my kingdom is not of this world, Pilate goes back in and says, where are you from? Jesus doesn't answer. And Pilate gets angry because he's not used to that. He's not used to people not answering him. And he says, you won't speak to me and I have the power to crucify you? And the Lord just answers, you would have no power over me unless it had been given you from above. Now Pilate is really afraid. Now, why would Pilate be afraid? Again, people say, oh no, this never happened. Pilate wouldn't be nervous about executing Jesus. But if you think about the way people thought about their own world, Pilate would have every reason to be afraid because Jesus was not like anybody who had ever been brought forward to Pilate. Just think about it. As Pilate is questioning Jesus the first time before the scourging, Pilate is having a conversation. Jesus is talking about truth, and Pilate is asking him about his kingdom. And Jesus is not begging for his life. He's not afraid of Pilate. He's not intimidated by Pilate. He's not asking for time to prepare a defense. He's not asking for witnesses to be brought. He's standing there completely confident, not afraid of Pilate. And Pilate was used to people being afraid of him. And now the Jewish leaders say this man claims to be a god. And Pilate thinks maybe he is. And now Jesus won't answer him. And Jesus says, you don't have any power except what was given to you from above. And now Pilate thinks he might really be a god because you and I know, being Greeks, that this was part of the Greco-Roman world. Gods came to earth, right? And looked like ordinary human beings. And the ancient Greeks and Romans had lots of stories about how people mistreated the gods, right? Or there was mythologies about how the gods were insulted by humans and how they took their revenge on those humans. And Pilate thinks that Jesus might very well be a god. And I've never read this in any other interpretation or explanation or any commentary. But it's so obvious if you're thinking like an ancient Greek or an ancient Roman. So he was thinking that, I'm not sure about this guy, but I really don't want to have anything to do with this anymore. Of course, we know that from Matthew's gospel that he got a message from his wife, have nothing to do with this man. Yeah. He was trying to get rid of this case. And he also sends him to Herod for that reason, so that he would have nothing more to he doesn't want to deal with Jesus. But it's in his lap because the Jewish leaders are insisting that he be crucified. And what do they say that finally gets Pilate to agree? And he actually says, it's not my doing. I'm washing my hands of this. This is all on you. Take him away and crucify him yourselves. The first time he says that, you take him, you crucify him. He didn't mean literally that they should take him, but he's saying that he didn't find that Jesus had committed any broken any Roman law. He's not guilty of treason. He's not guilty of anything for which he deserves to die. So what do they finally do? And I think this is one of the most interesting aspects of the story. They say, if you don't put him to death, you are no friend of Caesar. And it is after that St. John tells us that Pilate ascends the judgment seat and says, to behold the man. And he says, you're going to, they say, crucify him, crucify him. He says, you will crucify your king? And they say, we have no king but Caesar, which is blasphemy in itself, because God is supposed to be their king, you see. But Pilate is furious with them. They forced him to send Jesus to the cross. Why? What about this being friend of Caesar? Well, Pilate knew, and the Jewish leaders knew, that one of the closest friends of Tiberius Caesar his name is Elias Sejanus, had been executed for being disloyal to Tiberius. Now, all the Roman emperors were very paranoid, okay, because somebody always wanted to kill them, right, and take the throne. Well, Tiberius Caesar had executed just a few months before one of his closest advisors, Sejanus, on a charge of treason, and a lot of other people around him, okay? Now, whether or not Pilate actually knew Sejanus, we can't say. But what they were saying is this: if you don't put Jesus to death, we will tell Pilate, we will tell Tiberius that you, Pilate, refused to execute someone whom we brought to you on a charge of treason. And guess what? Pilate would be put to death because Tiberius would suspect Pilate of being disloyal. So they basically blackmailed Pilate. And that part of the story, for some reason, escapes me. But that's what I explained in the book.
That's true. That's so extremely interesting. And we don't understand, we don't see, we don't know that. And then I guess one of the other things we don't understand, and you said, they scourged Jesus, and then crucifixion, and how reading about it, how terrible and how terrifying it was, and how humiliating of a death, the perception of, what crucifixion was, and that the Lord, went through that, and
Yes, and he accepted it in his great humility. And, I know that, first of all, for the people, I hope you'll get the book and read the book. I have had people tell me that they skipped over the parts about the crucifixion or the crown of thorns and what that involved. I don't dwell on it. I do discuss it from a medical point of view, but it's not very gory or anything like this. But I do talk about it very factually because I know people don't want to hear about it, they don't want to read about it, but I think that as Christians, if the Lord was willing to go through that, we should at least read about it and understand it and have a better appreciation for what it was. We will never endure that level of pain, but at least we can have an appreciation for what the Lord was willing to do for us. So for us to say, I don't want to read about that, I don't want to think about it, I think we owe it to him to learn about it.
And I guess it's a part of what St. Paul mentions, right? How much it's in God's wisdom that he showed us through this way to save us. So it's not...
Yes, we know that the cross was very humiliating, but I just spent some time talking about what it meant in that culture that I think really deepens for people what that meant for the Lord, and how we in the Orthodox Church and no other church keeps talking about the voluntary nature of the death of Christ, that he willingly went to his crucifixion, that he chose to do this. It's astonishing, but of course, and the fact that the Lord, yes, like you said, St. Paul said, that it's the wisdom of God too. The cross really represents the wisdom of God, because none of us would have ever thought of anything like that.
I think one of the things that also, struck me when I was translating was, and I was thinking of us today, like the modern world. So all these people, and I'm not talking about the people that they understood and they follow Christ. I'm talking about the people that did not believe, and like the Pharisees, right? That they were so religious, so they tried to please God, but they had God in front of them, and they didn't realize. Yes. And it's today, and I'm coming to like thinking of us today and in this world, thinking that if we had God in front of us today, would we realize, or is our heart so hardened?
Πρέπει να προσέχουμε τόσο πολύ, διότι μπορούμε οι Ορθόδοξοι, τώρα που ετοιμαζόμαστε να πάμε να έχουμε την Μεγάλη Σαρακοστή, πολλές φορές, we focus so much on the fasting, on rules, and that's what the Pharisees were doing. And they were so intent on, this is what I have to do to please God, that they, like you said, didn't even recognize God in front of them, because they became self-righteous. And I think that we have to be very careful as Orthodox Christians not to think that because we are doing all of these things, I go to church every Sunday, that because we do those things, that we are somehow acceptable to God because of these things. What matters is the heart. It's our humility, it's our love of neighbor. This is the important thing. And not that those things don't matter, I'm not saying this, but we have to be very careful not to become proud. You see, the Lord did not say, don't fast like the Pharisees did, don't go to the temple, but don't do these things in order to be seen, or don't do these things so that, and think that somehow you're acceptable to God. But we have to keep that humility. So I think about that sometimes too. They were so sure of themselves. They were so certain of what they stood for and what they believed, that this is what God wanted, to keep the law like this, that they couldn't accept him. But I think it has more to do because of their own pride. That's why pride is the worst sin, right? It keeps us away from God. They hated him. They were jealous of him because because of his eloquence, and because of the fact that the people loved him, and because he had these remarkable abilities to heal people. And rather than looking at the scriptures and saying, this is really fulfilling the prophecies, they were jealous because he wasn't doing what they thought the Messiah would do. The Messiah would keep the law perfectly. He wouldn't touch any lepers. He wouldn't let any sinful women kiss his feet. He wouldn't do this. He wouldn't go to the house of a tax collector. He wouldn't do any of those things. So because they had in their idea what the Messiah, in their mind, what the Messiah would be like, they assumed that Jesus was wrong, that he was a bad rabbi, that he was a bad example. And they refused to look beyond their own ideas, because their ideas were what made them righteous in their own mind. And if they had to give that up, then and have to do like what Christ was asking for, humility, they didn't want that, because they loved, like he says, the places of honors, people to say rabbi and the scribes, and to be, there was too much invested in their life, that they liked to have their θέση. Αυτό είναι. Ο κόσμος θέλει τη θέση.
Θέλει το δικό, έτσι.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I'm sure everybody is expecting to read this book in Greek. And I'm so thankful for your time and for us, giving some information to people so they know what to expect, they know what to look for it.
Και εγώ σας ευχαριστώ για τη δουλειά που έκανες και το μοναστήρι. Για τη μετάφραση. It's very, very special to me. Γιατί εγώ ξέρω, έχουμε και εμείς συγγενείς που δεν διαβάζουν αγγλικά, και I'm very excited που θα μπορούν να αγοράσουν αυτό το βιβλίο ή να τους το στείλω αυτό το βιβλίο, να τους δώσουμε αυτό το βιβλίο να το διαβάσουν στη ελληνική γλώσσα.
Εμείς ευχαριστούμε. Ένα μήνυμα για το ελληνικό κοινό που θα το πάρει. A message, something for the Greek audience that they're going to read this book. I know you know the relationship and the love you have.
Yes. Καλή Σαρακοστή. Να είναι ευλογημένοι. Αυτό μόνο. Τι να σας πω. Σας ευχαριστώ για όλα.
Αυτό είναι
ο Θεός να μας προσέχει και την Ορθόδοξη Εκκλησία δική μας, και να μείνουμε πολύ devoted. Let's remain devoted and strong as Orthodox Christians. Η Ορθόδοξη especially stuff that σε μέρη σαν την Ελλάδα, σαν την Ρωσία, δεν καταλαβαίνουν τι έχουν. Στην Ορθοδοξία. Το θησαυρό που έχουμε εμείς, the treasure of orthodoxy, unless you are with people who are of other types of Christians, you can't appreciate it. So πρέπει να προσέχουμε αυτό το θησαυρό πάρα πολύ. And pass it on to the next generation.
Sure. Ευχαριστούμε πολύ, Πρεσβυτέρα.
Εγώ σας ευχαριστώ.